Everyone help us welcome Miss Jessica Childress to the show. Woo!
Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Justin and Eddie. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, if there's one thing I know about lawyers is that you have a lot of billable hours. So we appreciate your time because I know you are probably very busy.
No, you all are busy as well. You're doing incredible work. So thank you so much for having me. All of our time is valuable, but this is really a pleasure to spread important information.
Yeah, we're excited to share a little, maybe like a little different sector for our listeners of just like what's out there in the world. I think the topic of just like workplace discrimination, harassment, retaliation, even the phrase of like toxic workplace is probably something that unfortunately a lot of us are familiar with or have seen, have heard about. So I know any information that you're going to have today for our listeners is going to be super helpful, either in the near future or in the distant future. It's all super helpful. So thank you.
My pleasure.
So let's kick it off. One of the main reasons why we wanted to have you on the show is because you did just write a really excellent book about toxic workplace environments and breaking up with toxic workplace environments. It's a topic that's gaining a lot more traction. More and more people are talking about it. We had the Great Resignation in the wake of COVID. We've talked a lot about it on the show. People are really tired of a workplace environment that takes advantage of them, that doesn't prioritize their mental health, that prioritizes money and profit over the actual well-being of people. So when we had the opportunity to bring you on the show, we were like, yes, this is amazing. So tell us a little bit about your journey into writing this book and how you got into this topic.
Sure. So, Justin and Eddie, again, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It really is a pleasure to speak with your audience. I have always wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I think one of the reasons behind wanting to be a lawyer is that I just hated the idea of injustice. So I was the kid who was standing up to bullies, on the bus and on the playground and just calling out anything that was unfair. I know I probably got on my parents' nerves because I was always like, this is unfair and tell me the reason behind that, and really getting people to justify their decisions. So just a short synopsis of my life. I was on the high school debate team, on a debate team called the Lincoln Douglas debate team, where we advocated for positions on very interesting topics, whether companies that violate or whether countries that violated human rights should be subject to economic sanctions was my first debate. And I was in 10th grade, actually 9th grade, I believe, debating this topic, and it just stuck. I mean, it stuck with me because that was just such a random topic, but an important one. So those were the types of topics that we debated, and they were topics of justice. And after high school, I went off to UVA, was on our student judiciary committee my first year, and we were, my panelists, my co-judges and we were judges on the judiciary committee. So we sat on panels where we adjudicated cases of student misconduct involving first-year students, which was incredible. And then I went off after my first year, to be a counselor on the Judiciary Committee, representing students who were involved in violations of the university codes of conduct. And we also had the opportunity to represent the university in cases against students and represent the position of the university. And then I went off to law school, and the rest is a bit of history. My first job was clerking for a federal judge, where I had the opportunity to see employment law cases that came through the court. And then after my clerkship, that was a year long, I went off to work in what's called big law in the industry. So that's big corporate law, representing some of the best companies in the world in employment disputes. So from a management side perspective, so I got the opportunity to create employment handbooks, employment policies, conduct trainings on best practices in employment law, and educate employers on key employment laws that they needed to know, and even do employment litigation, which is what I've done throughout my career. I did a brief stint at the Department of Justice. I like to say that I did time because I worked for the Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons is the organization, or it's the federal agency that they're the administrative body for the Bureau of Prisons. And so I did employment side work, management side work there, and just got a lot of experience working with the EEOC and handling discrimination and harassment cases for management side officials who were working in prisons. And so that was just an incredible experience. And I just gained so much experience, trial experience in that particular position. Then went off to Big Law, went back to Big Law again. And then in 2016, I opened up my own firm where I now represent both employees and employers in employment law disputes. I conduct internal investigations for companies who are undergoing investigations about any employee misconduct. And I conduct trainings about how to create safe workplaces, how to create respectful workplaces. And that's really just what I love. I love educating employers about best practices because no one wants to work in a toxic work environment. And I really don't think people intentionally try to create toxic work environments. But a lot of toxic work environments, as I'm sure we'll talk about, are born from ignorance and not knowing what the requirements are, not knowing what you're actually saying or doing that could create an unsafe workplace for people. And so I really want to help organizations understand their obligations. And then if these organizations don't understand what their obligations are, or are not compliant with those obligations, I think it's important for employees to understand how to leave. So that's really what brought me to writing my book, and we can talk more about it as we go on in the episode. But that was my quote unquote brief synopsis.
No, that was great. I think it's cool to see your whole journey. I really appreciate your story of like when you were younger, of like ever since you're like 8-9 years old, wanting to be a lawyer and standing up for basically what's right and going about making the right decisions or what's fair for people, fair and just. Do you feel, this might be a little too like existential, but do you think like the young Jessica and her want to like do things that are right, or your clerkship and your early experiences, or is it a combination of both that really led you to specialize in things like workplace discrimination, harassment, and retaliation?
That's a great question, Eddie. So I have always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. I think I wanted to, just that idea of not being able to tolerate, I'm sorry, there's a plane going over me.
No
so
worries.
I'm sorry, I think we have to edit that out. I live in DC and there's just...
Can you start at the beginning of your response?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Eddie, that's a great question. I think that I have always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. And I knew when I was an undergrad, I think at the end of my undergraduate experience, after doing some internships when I was an undergrad, that I wanted to be a civil rights attorney and protect civil rights in some way. I didn't know if that would be educational civil rights. I didn't know if that would be housing civil rights, but I did know that I just could not tolerate injustice, and I really wanted to change institutions. And when I got to law school, I think the natural trajectory or just the common, not natural, but the common trajectory for students who went to my law school was to go into corporate law. And so that was just kind of a natural path. It was just the common path. Many students did go into public service. I did go into corporate law, but I wanted to do something that would still have a civil rights component. And employment law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is the preeminent civil rights law. So that protects against discrimination on the basis of race, age, color, national origin, sex, pregnancy. Actually pregnancy, there's a separate act for that. But this is the preeminent civil rights statute, and that is really what you are arguing when you are taking on a case involving employment civil rights primarily. They're state analogous statutes, but the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is really what you need to know, and then states have their own version of their civil rights statutes. And so this was just a way for me to still be a civil rights attorney, even though when I started practicing, I was representing only management side officials.
And I think you brought up a great point there, that there are certain things that you can get legal help for in terms of if you've been discriminated on the basis of race, religion, pregnancy status. And that's, I think, an important point, and expand on that a little bit. Like, when do people start to seek legal help? Because I think a lot of people work in a lot of toxic work environments, but I'm not sure if they know when you can actually start trying to get a lawyer, maybe start to look into discrimination, harassment, things like that. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think it's really hard for people to recognize that something is going wrong. I think people want to believe that the best in people. And so even thinking, okay, something is awry here, I really need to talk to someone about it. Even talking to the people in your friend circle or your family circle could be hard because you don't want to think that something is going wrong. So talking to a lawyer, just picking up the phone or sending an email to say, hey, I want to talk to you, that can be a very, very hard step because it first takes the acknowledgement that something has arisen to the level that legal counsel needs to come in and be an advocate. So I think it's really, really important, the step where I think people should, or when people should actually consult with an attorney. I think it really is when you feel as though you really can't take this environment anymore, or it could be an assault. If you're assaulted, I think that you've been assaulted, right? It's pretty obvious that that's an obvious example. But even so, you can still, even with an assault, you can still feel shocked. You don't know what to do. You're still wondering, hey, did that really, really happen? Even though it could be very obvious that it happened. And so it takes an acknowledgement first that something bad has happened. I think that sometimes it's the people around us that tell you, hey, I think this might be a violation. I really think that you should talk to someone about this. In trainings that I give, and I think many, many people who give anti-harassment trainings, they do go over what the law requires. I mean, if you're not giving that information as a trainer, not really sure what you're doing, because that's the baseline. It's that you have to inform employees and employers about what the law is. And so but that training often happens once a year. So it's not and this is not the training, I'm an employment lawyer, so I think all of this is just fascinating. But if that's not your job, you might just be checking the box. You might not retain that information. And so you might be wondering, hey, like what is discrimination? What's harassment? Did this happen? Where's my employment handbook? How do I report? And so it can be very hard just because of an information disadvantage. There could be, someone might not even have their employment handbook to know how to report something, or to know how their company defines harassment or discrimination, or to know how the law defines harassment and discrimination or a toxic work environment. And so I think the information, just knowing, okay, something bad has happened, the acknowledgement's important, and then the courage to actually pick up the phone and call someone and to call an attorney. I think that's really what's required.
Mm-hmm. I think your point of having a hard time like knowing when it's like something is going wrong, like resonated with me a little bit. This is like subjective, but I feel like probably my last employer and maybe even the first two, like there were some things where I just had a really hard time, and I had a hard time getting to the point of saying that like something was wrong for like a bunch of different reasons. One that stuck out as you were sharing that is like, maybe I just need to be more grateful that I have this job, and I just need to be more appreciative that I get to work here, and I love other pieces of my job. So if I like that, then I have no reason to complain. So as you're saying that, I'm like, oh man, like that's really sticking out to me. And I'm sure a lot of other people probably have felt similarly, that it's like it's hard to ask for help already. And maybe I should just be more grateful of what I have in front of me, and like just let the other things like slide away.
Absolutely, Eddie. I mean, that's 1000% correct. I think that there are many considerations to making a report. I always train employees and employers about the importance of making a report of discrimination or harassment, because internally, not even externally, but internally, because the company has to know that something wrong is going on so that they can then take action to correct it. But it can be very difficult to say something internally because you are afraid that you might lose your job. You go through the feelings of, should I feel grateful just to have this position? Many of us are caretakers. Many people are parents. We have to have money to live. And so this is our livelihood, right? And so reporting something could mean, if a work environment is not understanding if an organization does not understand their legal obligations, they could act in a way that's retaliatory and unlawful if someone does make a report. So it's really, really important that organizations understand what their practices and what their culture should be. I know for me, when I was working in a place that really should have understood what their legal obligations were, they did something that I thought was unlawful, and I did say something about it. But it took a long time for me to think about, or for me to actually say, okay, I actually need to say something. And I went through this entire analysis about whether or not I should say something. Should I just be grateful? Should I just let it go? And I ultimately did say something. But in that moment, I realized that it's really hard for people. I'm a trained advocate and have been advocating for other people for years, have been advocating for, positions for years. And it was really difficult in that time for me to say, hey, like, this is wrong. Like, this is what you all did wrong. This is how this needs to be corrected. I know, like, I was cursed at when I was actually, and it was profanity that was used during a discussion, and it was directed to me, and I didn't say anything. It was really inappropriate. It was someone who had a position of authority within an organization, and I didn't say anything. I just froze and took it. But I know that for me, having to work with that person again was really scary because I then just shut down. I wasn't going to feel like I could do my best when I was afraid to work with someone because of the way that they would talk to me. And so it's really difficult to speak up because you are wondering, especially if there is a power imbalance, you're wondering, if you say something, is the person going to see the situation the same way that you did? But I do think it's important to speak up internally. And then a lawyer can really, I think, empower people to say, hey, yeah, you should say something. Something wrong did happen. And that validation can be all that it takes for someone to feel like they can speak up. A validation from someone who looks at these cases and advocates for these types of cases day in and day out.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Justin.
The word grateful has come up a few times, and I think that's a really important point where it feels like the older generation, their mindset was, you should be grateful to have a job. You should be grateful that that you're stable, you have a home. But I also think that mindset leaves a lot of room for abuse and abusing workers.
Yeah.
From someone who actually works in the field and works with this on a day-to-day, do you feel like the mindset is changing, that their culture is starting to understand, like, hey, it's okay to talk out about these things. It's okay to try and communicate so that we can make a more healthy work environment?
So I think that the Me Too movement really did help employers understand that harassment happens, and Me Too was centered in sexual harassment. But I think the premises are the same. The legal framework for racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, discrimination on the basis of any protected category is rooted in the same analysis as you would do for a sexual harassment case. And so the training that's required, you have to create an environment that's safe for employees. You have to investigate claims of any misconduct, especially discrimination and harassment. And you have to empower employees to report. And employers have to understand how to respond to reports of misconduct. And so I'm really grateful for that movement. And again, I didn't mean to use the word grateful, but I'm happy. That was just no pun intended. But I am very, very happy that we had that movement because I do think that it inspired organizations to make sure that they had some system in place to respond to complaints of discrimination and harassment. I think it also empowered workers to understand
Yeah.
that this is happening. You are not alone. And people think they're alone and they're not. So the social media movement that came out of Me Too, with people sharing stories that they never shared before, and then speaking up and calling out harassers, I think that was revolutionary in the way that we respond now to harassment claims. So I think there was a huge trend after 2018 in the way that employers train their employees to report. And I think there was more information surrounding the importance of reporting harassment and empowering. I mean, I think that that was just that's the key thing that I see that is the barrier to reporting discrimination and harassment, is that people just don't feel empowered to do so.
Yeah. When it comes to reporting, like what should people know? Like how can someone go about reporting misconduct, harassment, whatever it is? Let's say just for example, we have someone who finally feels like, okay, I've dealt with this enough. My support system supports me. I've talked to enough people. I want to do something about it. What should people know about taking those next steps forward?
Sure. So organizations, I mean, large organizations, they should have a reporting policy. So large organizations should have a reporting policy. That reporting policy should be given to all employees upon on onboarding. And so when you start at a job, you really should get your employee handbook. That handbook should have a reporting policy to report any claims of misconduct. There should be a code of conduct somewhere within that employee handbook. And there should be a system that's outlined in that handbook that tells employees how to report claims of discrimination, harassment, abusive work environments. And that is standard. That's not the case for all organizations. If you are a small mom and pop business, you may not have had the resources to create an employee handbook or the time or the knowledge to create an employee handbook. So this is not the case industry wide. There you may not have an employee handbook, but if you are a mid-sized to large organization, there should be a reporting policy, and you should follow that reporting policy. If you don't know how to follow it, if you don't know where that policy exists, you should speak to HR. If it's safe to do so, you should speak to a supervisor if they're not the harasser. But typically there is a system built in to report to someone other than a harasser. If you feel that the person who is harassing you, of course, you're not going to want to report to them. So there should be a system built in to report to someone else. But I would start with finding that policy in your employee handbook. And this is where I think lawyers do come in. If you can't find that policy, you can talk to your lawyer about, hey, what do I do now? Do I need to report something to the board? Do I need to report something to the CEO? Do I need to report this to someone else, to a governmental organization? So that's really, I think that's the analysis that you should go through, but you should start with, okay, what's in my employee handbook? Let me first start to report internally.
What I love about what you do is that you're not only a lawyer and you're advocating for people, you're also creating all these trainings that are going to help employers create a better workplace environment for their employees. And we are going to have some resources in the show notes. So tell us a little bit about those, and also try and make a case for, if there are any board members out there, CEOs or anything listening to this, why is it so important to create a workplace environment that people feel safe in?
Absolutely. So thank you, Justin, for that intro. I am creating trainings. I've been doing trainings for years, training organizations on how to create safer workplaces, training employees on how to report, training managers on how to respond to claims of discrimination and harassment. But these trainings, I think organizations have to have the resources to bring in a trainer. And so often it is the more privileged organizations that are able to afford a training. And so I think that privilege trickles down, right? So if an organization doesn't have the resources to bring a trainer in, how are they going to empower and inform their employees about their obligations and their rights? So I do recognize that power imbalance and that just the resource inequity there. So it's important to me that information is accessible, and that's why I created my e-course, my upcoming ebook. It's coming out in January of 2024. But I wanted employees and employers to understand what their legal rights are, and I wanted employees to understand how to leave toxic work environments, because despite how much training we do, my intention is to make sure that workplaces are safe. But if a workplace remains unsafe, I don't think that people should stay in those work environments. I mean, of course, it's going to depend on their individual circumstances. Everyone has to do an assessment as about, what does my life require? Some people don't have an option, unfortunately. But in my book and e-course, I try to lay out what are some of the alternatives. Can you ask to work in a different department? Can you ask to take some administrative leave? If you are undergoing some sort of psychological or physical distress because of your work environment, is FMLA, Family Medical and Leave Act, leave available? What are your leave policies? So there are a host of options that may not include absolutely leaving. You also have to think about what are your post-work restrictions. Are there any restrictive covenants that prohibit you from going to work in another industry? So there are many, many things that you should consider. I actually have a checklist that I'll give you to put into the show notes, in which people can. There's a checklist with key considerations that you should make before leaving a toxic work environment, because it's not just a open and shut decision. It really is multifaceted. So that is one of the resources that is going to be in my e-course and in my e-book. But I wanted to create information that was accessible, because I think that we don't have enough accessible information. Attorneys are expensive. And again, there is a barrier to accessing an attorney that's licensed to practice within your jurisdiction. It's not the case that you can just pick up the phone and you're going to receive legal representation. So this is an informational resource it's not legal advice, but it will provide information so that people can at least have a starting point.
Cool. I want to be mindful of time, Jessica. I know we're close to the end of this.
This went by so quickly. I can't believe it.
Time flies when you're having fun. That's what Justin and I always say when we record. As we wrap up, any parting words, anything that you want to give our listeners as we wrap up today's episode? I feel like I just got so much information that I feel very appreciative. I'm always impressed with how much lawyers can reference years and acts and laws and things like that. So that's really cool for me. But any parting words for our listeners as we start to wrap up for today?
Absolutely. Well, let me just say, Justin and Eddie, this has just been a true pleasure. Again, I just love the work that you're doing, because knowledge is power. And when we hear that you're not alone, when you hear that this happens, workplace misconduct happens all the time. And it's important to feel empowered enough to say something. And you don't know how and we haven't talked about bystander intervention and speaking up for other people, but even if you're not the person who's enduring a toxic workplace, if you are listening and you know of someone who is enduring a toxic workplace, let them know that they're not alone. Let them know that there are resources available to them. And make sure that we never normalize toxic work environments. It's very easy to just laugh off inappropriate comments and not say anything because we're uncomfortable. But when we do those things, it allows toxic work environments to fester, and we don't want to do that. So call out things even if it's uncomfortable, and know that you're not alone if you are enduring a toxic work environment.
Cool. Thank you so much. Justin, you got anything?
Yeah, just a reminder that in this country, in our society, we spend a lot of our time at work. And if we're in a toxic work environment, it can be really hard on our mental health. It can increase anxiety, it can increase depression. And I've known some people who have worked in some pretty toxic work environments, and they come home and they just need to vent for a long time because they need to get a lot of things off their back. So this is really important. This is important for our society. This is important for our mental health. I'm so appreciative of the work that you're doing in trying to make this better for Americans in general. I think it's such a cool thing. And I love that you have such a wealth of resources that people can access that actually make things better.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eddie and Justin.
Yeah. I'll make our wrap up short and sweet. You know where to find our podcast if you're listening to it. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever you're using. All our social medias are at Millennial MHC. And as always, take care of y'all mentals.